Now, I clearly am not a preacher, I'm not an orator like Dr. King, and so I really would urge you to Google Martin Luther King's mountaintop speech and to listen to it. It's really quite moving. But what is important is that his reference to the mountaintop and the fact that he might not get there. He's been able, God has allowed him to look over into the promised land. He might not get there, but the people will get there, is really a reference to the death of Moses. In the end of the book of Deuteronomy, God tells Moses to go to a mountaintop. He's not allowed to enter the promised land because of something that he had done earlier. He's not given the privilege of actually getting into the promised land. But God, at the end of Deuteronomy, tells Moses to go to a mountaintop and look over and see the promised land. And then he dies. Moses dies. So King's reference to going on the mountaintop and looking over, he may not get there, but he knows his people will get there, is a clear reference to the death of Moses. And indeed, the very next day, Dr. King was shot to death. Now, I ask students very often if they think that had I been there and had I walked up to Dr. King and said, Dr. King, do you know you're going to be shot tomorrow? I honestly don't think that Dr. King would have said, yes, I know. I don't think that Dr. King was necessarily predicting his death. What Dr. King was doing, however, is he was a person who was clearly aware of what was happening in his world. He saw events of his world very clearly and understood the consequences of those events. And he understood very clearly that there were many people who opposed him, that there were many people who hated him, that there were many people who wanted to stop him. And he knew that there was a very good chance, if not it being inevitable, that he would be assassinated. And he understood that because he understood what was happening very clearly in his world. And I then show another video, the famous I Have a Dream speech. And again, I would urge you to Google Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream, and to watch the speech. It's a very, very powerful speech. We all know those famous lines, I have a dream. And the speech starts off, Dr. King says that he really is gathered with his people that day. They were gathered on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on August 4th, 1963. In fact, you can go to the Lincoln Memorial today and walk up the steps to the middle platform there, the first landing. Right in the middle, there's a circular plaque that marks the spot where Dr. King spoke, and you can see a plaque devoted to that marks the spot where he spoke. And he starts off by saying that he's gathered with the 250,000 people that were gathered on the National Mall that day. He was gathered there to cash a check, as he put it. He said, when the founders of our country, the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, he said they were issuing a promissory note that guaranteed justice and liberty and freedom for everyone. And he then said that he was coming to cash that check. He said that people of color in the United States had been issued a bum check. It was a check that came back, it bounced. It came back insufficient funds. But he was convinced that the bank, as he said, the Bank of Justice is not bankrupt, and that indeed the country will keep its promise, and that the check will end up being good. And he does have something of a veiled hint that he is concerned that if he and his movement are unable to achieve that justice and civil rights peacefully, as he was certainly pushing for, he understood that there were others in the community that might not be so peaceful. And of course we know that there were others, the Black Panthers and others, that were not willing to be as peaceful as Dr. King was. And it's not a threat, it's just a warning. Again, he is clearly aware of what's going on in his world, and he understands that if the check is not made good, that there are others in the community that may seek to redress that imbalance through violence. And then he gives his famous "I have a dream." And I always ask students in the classroom, does anybody remember what the first words after those words? He says, despite all of our difficulties, I still have a dream. And I say, so what are the words that come immediately after that? And of course, most students don't know. And the words that come immediately after that are, it is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. He says, despite all of our difficulties, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. It's not his dream, it's our dream. In other words, Dr. King, the prophet, understands very clearly what is going on in his world. And he also understands very clearly what the core values of his people are. And he's able to articulate those core values. And he's also able to articulate the consequences of his people not being true to their core values, the consequences that could ensue from his people not being true to their core values. But he also has a great hope of what would transpire and what will transpire if the people are true to their core values. And he gives that hope. Now, again, I want to suggest that the prophet is not a fortune teller. We also know, for instance, that on November 4th, 2008, when Barack Obama was elected President of the United States, he stood in Grant Park in Chicago and expressed to the nation that he understood his election as being something of a fulfillment of Dr. King's dream. Now, again, had I gone to Dr. King on August 4th, 1963 and said, Dr. King, I hear your dream of, that your nation will live up the true meaning of its creed, that all men are created equal. As you know, Dr. King, on November 4th, 2008, a black man, an African-American, Barack Obama, will be elected President of the United States. Of course, Dr. King would say, who's Barack Obama? What kind of name is that? He wasn't predicting the election of Barack Obama, but he was expressing hope that America would live up to its true core values. And it was Barack Obama looking back at that prediction, looking back at that dream, understanding himself. It's not a prediction, it's a self-understanding. It's an understanding of Barack Obama that Barack Obama understood himself as something of a fulfillment of that dream. I want to just review sort of what I said about prophets, what a prophet is based on my assertion that Martin Luther King was a kind of a prophet. Was a prophet, as a matter of fact, not a kind of a prophet, but I feel that he was a prophet. And I have a document that I did tell you to download in preparation for this lecture from my courses. It's called Features of Prophecy, and I would like you to have that in front of you right now so that I can review this. And I say a prophet is a person who uniquely perceives the events of his or her day and their broader historical and transcendent significance. They understand what's going on in their world and what the significance of that is in a broad historical perspective and even in a transcendent cosmic divine perspective. They uniquely perceive the core values of their people, the mission and purpose of the people. A prophet is able to articulate those core values and to hold the people accountable to those core values. The prophet is able to understand the consequences of not fulfilling those core values and is also able to articulate a message of hope that ultimately those core values will be fulfilled. Now, I find this very important because when we go to study the written prophets, the classical prophets, in particular the ones that we're studying for today, Amos, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, I think we have to keep these features in mind, particularly the one that says that the prophet is uniquely able to understand or perceive the events of his or her day. These men that we're going to be studying, Amos, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, they were people who preached. They went out into the streets and preached, or they went to the king and preached, or they went to the priests and preached. They were preachers primarily. They might have done some writing as well, but they had an immediate audience. And I'm sorry to say this, but I believe it is true. We are not their audience. Their audience is their people. The people gathered in the streets and the squares of the cities and villages that they visited, the kings that they spoke to, the priests that they spoke to, the other leaders that they spoke to. That was their audience. That's who they were speaking to. Now, as any great writers, orators, they certainly understood that they had a legacy, and I'm sure they hoped to have a legacy, but we are not really their primary audience. Their audience was their people, and they were responding to events of their day and keep holding people accountable to those core values, as I mentioned before, in light of what was happening and in response to what was happening in their contemporary world. And I think it is critical, if we want to understand the prophets, to understand that.